What would you do if the telegram that promised salvation delivered you straight into the hands of your family's killer? Clara thought Montana would bury her past forever, but some secrets refuse to stay buried. When the man who destroyed everything she loved comes calling with fire and death, she'll discover that sometimes the only way forward is to stop running and fight back. If you love stories of resilience, forbidden attraction, and justice served cold as mountain snow, hit that like button and subscribe because this tale of the 1885 frontier will leave you breathless. She inherited a ranch to escape her past, but her family's killer followed her to Montana. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in Boston, cutting through Clara Whitmore's carefully constructed life like a blade through silk. Clara Whitmore, stop. Uncle Theodore, deceased. Stop, ranch yours under conditions. Stop, must reside minimum 2 years. Stop, contact Morrison Law Billings, Montana. Stop. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words again, standing in her cramped boarding house room that smelled of other people's desperation. Uncle Theodore. She pressed her eyes closed and saw him clearly for the first time in 13 years. Tall, weathered, with eyes the same gray-green as her father's. The last family gathering before everything burned. Before Rose died screaming Clara's name while flames consumed their Ohio ranch. Clara sank onto her narrow bed, the telegram crumpling in her grip. 7 years she'd spent in Boston, 7 years of tiny rooms and needle pricks, and pretending she'd never known the feel of a horse beneath her or the satisfaction of watching cattle grow fat on summer grass. 7 years of telling herself that Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, was all she could ever be again. Now this. Now, a ranch in Montana Territory. Land that might mean freedom or might mean walking straight back into the nightmare she'd fled. But what choice did she have? The dress shop had closed 3 months ago. Her savings were gone. Soon she'd be on the streets, or worse, accepting the kind of help that came with prices no woman should have to pay. Clara stood and walked to her single window, looking out at Boston's brick and smoke and endless crowds. Somewhere in this city, women like her disappeared every day, ground down by poverty and desperation, until they became nothing more than cautionary tales whispered in boarding house hallways. In her mind, she heard Rose's voice from that terrible night. Clara, there is something in the barn that doesn't belong. Something he left behind. Promise me you'll remember. But Clara had run instead of remembering. Had spent 7 years trying to forget instead of seeking justice for the sister who died trying to save their horses from flames that burned too hot, spread too fast, consumed too completely to be accidental. Maybe it was time to stop running. The journey west took 6 days of rattling train cars and gritty transfer stations. Clara pressed her face to the window as civilization gave way to endless plains, then to mountains that rose like cathedral spires against impossible skies. The landscape grew wilder with each mile, more beautiful and more dangerous than anything Boston could imagine. She tried not to think about the last time she'd seen country like this, tried not to remember the smell of smoke or the sound of William Turner's voice promising her father that circumstances could change very quickly for families who didn't make reasonable business decisions. Montana Territory stretched before her like a promise and a threat combined. The train wheezed into Billings Station and Clara stepped onto the platform with her few possessions and a heart that hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The town was bigger than she'd expected, but still felt temporary, like a stage set that could be struck and moved if the performance didn't suit the audience. Clara found lodging at a small hotel and spent her first night listening to conversations about cattle prices and weather patterns and the dozen dangers that could destroy a year's work in a single day. She recognized the vocabulary, had grown up hearing these same concerns, these same careful calculations of risk and reward that defined frontier life. But Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, shouldn't understand such things, shouldn't feel the familiar tightness in her chest that came with planning seasonal operations and managing livestock through hard winters. The next morning brought her first encounter with the man who would change everything. Morrison Law occupied a modest office on Main Street. Clara arrived precisely at 9, wearing her one decent dress and the careful expression of a city woman overwhelmed by frontier possibilities. Miss Whitmore, the secretary, was middle-aged with kind eyes. Morrison is expecting you. Caleb Morrison rose as Clara entered his office, and she felt her carefully maintained composure falter for just a moment. He was younger than she'd anticipated, perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of hard work under open skies. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct, and something in his manner suggested depths that went well beyond legal training. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, gesturing to a chair. Theodore was a respected man in this valley. "Thank you, though I should be honest, I barely knew my uncle." Clara settled into the offered chair, hyper-aware of Caleb's assessing gaze. "We met twice in my entire life. He spoke of you more often than you might expect." Caleb consulted papers on his desk. "Theodore said you reminded him of someone he'd loved and lost many years ago. I believe he hoped Montana might offer you possibilities that life back east couldn't provide." Clara's throat tightened. Someone he'd loved and lost. Could Theodore have known her mother before she married Clara's father? The timing would be right, and it would explain why a distant uncle would leave valuable property to a niece he barely knew. "The ranch comprises 800 acres in the Gallatin Valley," Caleb continued. "Current livestock includes 62 head of cattle, 12 horses, and miscellaneous fowl. The property includes a main house, barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings." Clara nodded, processing information that sounded more valuable than anything she dared hope for. "And the conditions. You must reside on and actively manage the property for a minimum of 2 years. Failure to meet these requirements results in forfeiture to the territorial government." Caleb leaned back, studying her face. "It's not an easy life, Miss Whitmore. Montana can break people who aren't prepared for its challenges." "I understand the risks." Clara met his gaze directly, momentarily forgetting to seem intimidated by frontier possibilities. "Sometimes a person needs challenges more than comfort." Something flickered in Caleb's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of strength he hadn't expected to find in a city seamstress. "There's a foreman named Jack Sullivan who's worked the place for 5 years," he continued. "Good man, knows the land and livestock. If you're willing to learn, he's willing to teach." "When can I see the property?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. I'll take you out myself." Clara spent that evening in her hotel room trying to imagine herself as a rancher while fighting memories that threatened to overwhelm her careful defenses. The vocabulary of ranch management came back too easily, triggered responses she'd spent 7 years suppressing. She knew about breeding cycles and market timing and the 100 daily decisions that meant the difference between profit and disaster. But Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, shouldn't know such things, shouldn't feel the familiar excitement that came with planning operations and solving problems that had defined her childhood alongside Rose. Sleep came fitfully broken by dreams of fire and a sister's voice calling across impossible distances. "Clara, promise me you'll remember what doesn't belong." Caleb arrived at the hotel the next morning, riding a bay gelding and leading a gentle-looking mare. Dressed for work rather than town, he looked like a man more comfortable under open skies than behind a desk. "You ride?" he asked as Clara approached. "A little." She accepted his help, mounting, forcing herself to seem awkward with movements that should have been automatic. "I may be rusty." The ride to Theodore's property took them through country that stole Clara's breath. The Gallatin Valley spread like a green ocean, bounded by mountains that seemed close enough to touch, but distant as heaven. Cattle dotted the landscape, moving slowly across grassland that stretched to horizons that made Boston feel claustrophobic in memory. "Beautiful," Clara murmured and mained it. "Beautiful and dangerous," Caleb agreed. "Weather changes without warning. Predators are constant threats. Equipment failures can destroy months of work. But if you can handle the challenges, there's no place like it for building something that lasts." They rode in comfortable silence, and Clara found herself relaxing in the saddle despite her supposed inexperience. Muscle memory asserted itself regardless of her intentions to remain convincingly helpless. "You're a natural," Caleb observed. "Most city folks take weeks to find their seat." Clara forced herself to wobble slightly. "I'm just trying not to fall off." The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low hill. Clara's first impression was of solid functionality rather than beauty. Log buildings arranged around a central yard, corrals and pastures, spreading outward, everything built to last rather than impress. But it was the details that made Clara's chest tighten with recognition. The way the barn was positioned for efficient workflow, the placement of water troughs for optimal livestock management, the careful angles of fencing that indicated someone who truly understood animal behavior. Theodore had known what he was doing. More than that, He'd built something that reminded Clara painfully of home. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall and weathered, with the easy confidence Clara associated with people who'd spent their lives working with animals and weather and the 100 variables that defined ranch operations. Jack Sullivan, Caleb said by way of introduction. Jack, this is Clara Whitmore, Theodore's niece. Jack touched his hat brim. Miss Whitmore, sorry for your loss. Theodore was a good man and a fair boss. Clara dismounted carefully, maintaining her pretense of inexperience while studying Jack's face for signs of judgment or skepticism. She saw neither, only the patient assessment of a man who'd taught greenhorns before and understood the magnitude of what she was attempting. I understand you've been managing the ranch, she said. I'm grateful for your willingness to help me learn. Day-to-day operations, yes ma'am. Your uncle handled the business side, but I know the land and livestock. Jack gestured toward the buildings. Would you like to see the house first? The main building was larger than Clara had expected, with rooms that felt lived in despite their current emptiness. A massive stone fireplace dominated the central room with doorways leading to kitchen bedrooms and storage areas. Furniture was minimal but well-made, everything chosen for function and durability. It was the kitchen that made Clara's breath catch. Cast iron stove perfectly positioned for efficiency. Storage arranged for someone who understood food preservation and meal planning for working men. Windows placed to provide light for detailed work while offering views of approaches to the property. Her mother would have loved this kitchen. Theodore lived simply, Caleb observed, watching Clara's face. But he built to last. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. On the kitchen table sat a wooden box she hadn't noticed initially. Inside, she found papers, property records, livestock inventories, detailed notes about seasonal operations written in Theodore's careful script. But beneath the practical documents, Clara found something that made her heart stop. Letters, tied with faded ribbon. The top envelope addressed in handwriting she recognized despite 13 years in distance, and the careful walls she'd built around memories of home. Her mother's handwriting. Take your time looking around, Caleb said gently. We'll wait outside while you get your bearings. Clara waited until she heard their voices fade before untying the ribbon with shaking fingers. The first letter was dated 26 years ago, before Clara's birth, before her parents' marriage had seemed inevitable and unquestionable. My dearest Theodore, it began. I've made my decision, though it breaks my heart to write these words. James has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. I know you hoped for a different answer, but my circumstances make this choice necessary rather than desired. Please understand that what we shared was real, but sometimes real love must surrender to practical needs. I'll carry you in my heart always, but I must build my future with another. Your devoted Margaret. Margaret. Clara sank into Theodore's chair, letter trembling in her hands. Her mother's name had been Margaret, though Clara had never heard the full story of how her parents met or why they'd left Ohio's more settled areas for frontier life. Now she understood. Her mother had loved Theodore, first had chosen Clara's father for practical reasons rather than passion. And Theodore had never married, had spent decades alone on this beautiful, isolated ranch, nursing love for a woman who'd chosen security over heart. Clara read through more letters, watching the correspondence shift from love to friendship to the careful distance of people who'd shared too much to forget, but too little to claim. The final letter was dated 7 years ago, just after the fire. Theodore, our Clara survived, but Rose didn't. She's fled somewhere back east, won't tell us where, can barely speak of what happened. The fire took everything. The ranch, our savings, our future. James is broken by grief and failure. I fear for Clara's future if she remains alone much longer. If anything happens to us, please remember that she deserves happiness more than duty, love more than security. She's more like you than she knows, strong enough to build something beautiful if someone gives her the chance. Your Margaret. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, understanding finally why Theodore had left her this property with its demanding conditions. Not as burden, but as gift. Not as obligation, but as opportunity to claim the life her mother had wanted for her. Theodore had loved Margaret Whitmore enough to provide for her daughter when grief and loss made other provision impossible. Miss Whitmore, Jack's voice from the porch, everything all right? Clara quickly returned the letters to their box and wiped her eyes before opening the door. Fine, just overwhelmed by the generosity. She spent the afternoon touring the property with Jack and Caleb, learning systems she already understood while fighting emotions that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. Every building, every piece of equipment, every carefully planned detail reminded her of home and family and the life she'd thought was lost forever. The work's hard, Jack explained as they examined the barn with its well-designed stalls and storage areas, but satisfying if you've got the temperament for it. Animals don't care about your mood or the weather or how tired you are. They need tending regardless. Clara nodded, remembering mornings when she and Rose had raced to complete barn chores before breakfast, competing to see who could finish first without sacrificing quality. I understand, she said quietly. Some responsibilities can't be postponed. As the afternoon light began to slant toward evening, Caleb prepared to return to town. I'll check on you next week, he said as he saddled his horse. If you need anything urgent, send Jack with a message. Clara stood in the ranch yard watching him ride away, dust rising from his horse's hooves, until he disappeared beyond the first hill. The vastness of what she'd committed to settled over her like a weight that was part terror, part exhilaration. You sure about this? Jack asked quietly. City life and ranch life don't have much in common. Clara looked around the property that represented salvation and challenge in equal measure. I'm sure I need to try. Whether I succeed, that remains to be seen. That evening, Jack prepared dinner with the easy competence of a man who'd cooked for himself for years. Simple food, but well prepared, and Clara found herself genuinely hungry for the first time in months. Theodore was a good teacher, Jack said as they ate at the kitchen table. Patient with mistakes, generous with praise when it was earned. He'd want you to succeed here. Did he ever talk about my family, about why he left the property to me? Jack was quiet for a moment, considering his words. He'd get letters sometimes that would send him into melancholy moods for days. Said he'd made choices when he was young that shaped everything that came after. I think he regretted not fighting harder for something he wanted. Clara thought about the letters upstairs, about love, sacrifice to practical necessity, about decades of solitude that might have been avoided with different choices. Mr. Sullivan, she said carefully, did my uncle ever seem worried about anything, concerned about threats or dangers beyond the usual ranch problems? Funny you should ask that. Jack's expression grew thoughtful. Past couple years, he'd been getting visits from a man claiming to represent some mining company. Persistent fellow kept increasing offers to buy the property despite Theodore's clear refusal. Made Theodore nervous in ways I'd never seen before. Clara felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. And do you remember the man's name? Called himself Blackwood. Thomas Blackwood, from some development company. Rich man's clothes, expensive horse, talked like he was used to getting what he wanted. Jack paused, studying Clara's face. You look like you've seen a ghost. Clara forced her expression to remain neutral, while her mind raced through possibilities she'd prayed she'd never have to consider. Just tired, she said. It's been an overwhelming day. But as she prepared for bed in Theodore's house, surrounded by evidence of a life shaped by love and loss and careful solitude, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her past had followed her west after all. In the kitchen, Theodore's letters waited in their wooden box. Upstairs, a bedroom held quilts that might have been made by hands that loved the man who'd never stopped missing the woman he couldn't have. And somewhere in the Montana territory, a man named Thomas Blackwood was making offers that people seemed unable to refuse. Clara fell asleep that first night, fighting dreams of fire and waking to memories of Rose's voice. Promise me you'll remember what doesn't belong. Maybe it was time to start remembering instead of running. Maybe Montana would give her the strength to finally seek justice for the sister who'd died trying to save what they'd built together. Maybe Thomas Blackwood was about to discover that some women were harder to intimidate than others. The first week passed in routines that felt both foreign and familiar. Jack proved to be a patient teacher, demonstrating everything from basic horse handling to equipment maintenance with the steady competence Clara remembered from her father's best employees. Clara played her role carefully, showing just enough natural aptitude to justify rapid progress, while maintaining enough uncertainty to seem genuinely inexperienced. It was harder than she'd anticipated. Muscle memory kept asserting itself, threatening to reveal knowledge she couldn't safely possess. You learn fast, Jack observed, as Clara successfully saddled Dusty with minimal assistance. Most city folks take weeks to get comfortable around horses this size. Maybe I'm more coordinated than I thought. Clara deflected, forcing herself to fumble slightly with the bridle. Sewing requires precise hand movements. She spent mornings learning systems she already understood and afternoons helping with maintenance tasks that came back to her like half-forgotten songs. The work felt good, honest physical labor that produced immediate visible results. Her hands blistered despite years of needlework, but the pain felt cleaner than anything she'd experienced in Boston. Evenings were the hardest time. Alone in Theodore's house, surrounded by evidence of his decades of solitude, Clara found herself thinking about choices and consequences and the paths that led people to lives they'd never planned. She read through more of her mother's letters, watching the evolution from passionate love to resigned friendship to the careful distance of people who'd shared too much to forget but too little to claim. The correspondence painted a picture of quiet tragedy. Two people who'd loved each other but been separated by circumstance and duty. No wonder Theodore had never married. No wonder he'd built this beautiful, isolated ranch where memories could be treasured without interference from reality. Friday evening brought Clara's first real test when Caleb Morrison arrived for his promised check-in visit. She spotted him from the kitchen window riding into the yard with the easy grace that suggested he'd been born to the saddle. In town, dressed professionally, he'd seemed like any other businessman. Here, mounted against the backdrop of mountains and grassland, he looked like what he probably was beneath the lawyer facade, a man who understood hard country and harder choices. "Miss Whitmore, Jack." Caleb dismounted near the porch where Clara waited, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at his approach. "How's the education proceeding?" "She's a quick study," Jack said, pride evident in his voice. "Quicker than I expected for someone with no background." "Is that so?" Caleb's eyes met Clara's, something unreadable in his expression. "What do you think, Miss Whitmore? Are you finding ranch life suits you?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks under his direct gaze. "It's challenging but also satisfying in ways I didn't expect. There's something about working with animals, seeing immediate results from effort, different from city work. Very different. With sewing, you create something beautiful but essentially decorative. Here, everything serves a purpose. Everything matters." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's the difference between necessity and luxury. Out here, mistakes have consequences that go beyond inconvenience." Jack invited Caleb to stay for dinner, and Clara found herself cooking for three while the men discussed cattle prices and weather patterns and territorial politics. She listened while she worked, noting how Caleb's knowledge extended well beyond legal matters into the technical aspects of ranching itself. "You seem to know quite a bit about livestock management for a lawyer," Clara observed as they ate. "I grew up on a ranch about 20 miles south of here. Studied law back east, but came home when my father died to help my mother manage the family property." Caleb's expression grew distant. "Law practice is my profession, but ranching is in my blood. So you understand what I'm trying to learn." "I understand how difficult it is and how dangerous for someone unprepared." His gaze sharpened slightly. "Jack says you're learning almost too fast for someone with no background in this kind of work." Clara's heart jumped. Had she revealed too much competence? Been too quick with responses that should have required thought? "Maybe I'm more naturally suited to this life than I realize," she said carefully. "Or maybe desperation is a good teacher." Maybe. But his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. After dinner, Jack excused himself to check the horses, leaving Clara and Caleb alone at the kitchen table. Clara busied herself clearing dishes, acutely aware of his presence in the small space. "Clara." His use of her first name made her pause in her work. "Can I ask you something personal?" Her hand stilled in the dishwater. "Of course. What really brought you west? What happened in Boston that made staying impossible?" The question she'd been dreading. Clara kept her hands busy with washing while she considered how much truth she could safely reveal. "Nothing dramatic," she lied. "Just circumstances that made staying untenable and leaving necessary. Circumstances like poverty, like running from something that might follow you." Clara turned to face him, fully water dripping from her hands. "Why are you asking?" "Because I've seen people come west running from their past before. Some are running from things that deserve to be left behind. Others are running from things that need to be faced." His expression was serious concern rather than judgmental. "I want to make sure you understand what you're taking on by being out here alone." "I'm not alone. Jack is here." Jack won't be here forever. He's been talking about opportunities in Wyoming, better pay for managing a larger operation. If that happens, you'll need to handle this place entirely on your own, or hire help you might not be able to afford. The possibility of losing Jack's support sent anxiety through Clara's chest. She'd been counting on time to gradually reveal her competence to transition, slowly from student to capable rancher. "I'll manage," she said, aiming for confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Will you? Because sometimes challenges arise faster than preparation allows. Sometimes you need help from people who understand your real situation." He was standing close enough now that Clara could smell leather and sage and something essentially masculine that made her pulse quicken. When had she become so aware of him as a man, rather than just a lawyer managing her uncle's estate? "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if circumstances change, you might benefit from additional support. Someone with ranch experience who could provide guidance until you're fully capable. Someone like you. Someone exactly like me." The offer was reasonable, practical, exactly what Clara would need if she found herself truly alone on 800 acres with 60 head of cattle and no idea how to manage them. It was also dangerous. Caleb Morrison was too observant, too perceptive. Spending more time with him would increase the risk of exposure of someone recognizing that Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, knew far too much about ranching for someone supposedly learning everything from scratch. But it might also be necessary. And if Clara was being honest, the prospect of working closely with Caleb Morrison wasn't entirely unwelcome. "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but I couldn't afford to pay what such help would be worth." "Who said anything about payment? Neighbors help each other out here. That's how communities survive in hard country. We're neighbors. My family's ranch borders your eastern property line, has for 15 years. His smile was warm, genuine the first time Clara had seen his face completely relaxed. "Your uncle and my father had their differences over water rights and fence maintenance, but they worked them out like reasonable people." Clara dried her hands on a kitchen towel, using the motion to create some distance between them. Being close to Caleb Morrison affected her concentration in ways that could prove dangerous. "I appreciate the offer. If circumstances change, I'll remember it." "Good." Caleb moved toward the door, then paused. "Clara, there's something I want you to know. Montana territory can be dangerous for a woman alone. Wild animals, severe weather, men with questionable intentions. If you ever feel unsafe, if you need help for any reason, don't hesitate to send word." "Thank you. That's very kind." "It's practical. Dead neighbors don't make good neighbors." But his tone was gentle, suggesting kindness rather than mere pragmatism. After Caleb left, Clara stood on the porch watching dust settle from his horse's departure. The conversation had raised questions she wasn't prepared to answer and offered solutions that might prove more dangerous than the problems they solved. But it had also planted a seed of possibility, the chance that she might not have to face whatever was coming alone. The prospect of partnership rather than solitude, support rather than self-reliance. That night, Clara lay awake thinking about choices and trust in the increasingly complicated web of deception she was weaving. Every day brought new risks of exposure, new challenges to maintaining her carefully constructed identity, but also new reasons to hope that Montana might offer possibilities Boston never could. She fell asleep holding one of her mother's letters, thinking about love, sacrifice to practical necessity, and wondering if some chances were worth taking, regardless of potential consequences. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Jack brought it from town along with supplies, his expression grim as he handed Clara the envelope bearing unfamiliar letterhead. "Came through the territorial mail service," he said. "Looks official." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, afraid of what news might have followed her across the continent. The letterhead read, "Blackwood Mining and Development Company," in elaborate script. "Miss Whitmore," the letter began, "we understand you have recently inherited property in the Gallatin Valley. Our company is interested in purchasing ranch land for development purposes and would like to discuss terms that would be mutually beneficial. Please respond at your earliest convenience. Thomas Blackwood, President." Clara read the letter 3 times, her unease growing with each word. She'd never heard of Blackwood Mining, and nothing in Theodore's papers had mentioned mining interests in the valley. But the name Blackwood sent cold recognition through her chest. William Turner had used aliases before, had operated through shell companies and false identities when direct approach proved inconvenient. "What do you think?" she asked Jack, handing him the letter with hands that shook slightly. Jack's frown deepened as he read. "Never heard of these people, and I've been in this valley 5 years, know most of the established businesses. Mining companies showing sudden interest in ranch land seems suspicious." Suspicious how? Mining requires specific geological conditions. Theodore's property has good grazing land and water rights, but I've never seen signs of mineral deposits worth commercial extraction. Jack folded the letter, handed it back to Clara. "Could be legitimate, but could also be speculators trying to acquire land cheap for reasons they're not sharing." Clara filed the letter away, but the feeling of unease lingered. She'd thought Montana would be far enough from her past to provide safety. Now strangers were showing interest in her property for unclear reasons. That afternoon brought relief in the form of an unexpected visitor. A woman rode into the ranch yard with the easy confidence of someone completely at home on horseback. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, weathered but handsome, with steel gray hair braided practically down her back. "You must be Theodore's niece," the woman said as she dismounted. "Margaret Sullivan. I run the ranch west of here." Clara had heard Jack mention the Sullivans. Successful operation, Margaret managing it alone since her husband's death several years earlier. One of the few women in the valley running her own place. "Clara Whitmore, pleased to meet you." "Likewise." Margaret's handshake was firm, her gaze assessing but friendly. "Heard you were learning the business. How's it going?" "Slowly but steadily. Jack's been very patient with my education." Margaret nodded toward where Jack was working with horses in the corral. "Jack Sullivan's my brother-in-law. Good man, excellent teacher. He tells me you're picking things up faster than most beginners." Clara's pulse quickened. Another person noticing her rapid progress, another potential exposure of her carefully maintained deception. "Maybe I'm more suited to this life than I expected," she said carefully. "Maybe, or maybe you have more background than you're admitting." Margaret's voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp. "I've been ranching since I was 12 years old. I know what that kind of childhood looks like in a person." Clara felt trapped by Margaret's perceptive gaze. "What do you mean, the way you move around horses? No hesitation, no uncertainty. The way you assess livestock. Most city folks look at cattle and see an undifferentiated mass of animals. You look at them and evaluate individuals." A distant rumble of thunder suggested afternoon storms building over the mountains. Clara gestured toward the porch. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside." They settled in Theodore's main room as the promised storm began, with droplets of rain against the windows. Margaret accepted coffee but declined food, settling into her chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to direct conversation. "Why does it matter?" Clara asked finally. "What I did or didn't know before coming here?" "Because lies have a way of catching up with people in small communities. If you're hiding your background, you probably have good reasons. But Jack's leaving soon, and you're going to need help from people who understand what you're really capable of." Lightning flashed bright enough to illuminate the room through the windows, followed immediately by thunder that shook the walls. Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I grew up on a ranch in Ohio," she said quietly. "My father raised cattle and horses. I learned everything I'm pretending to learn now before I was 15 years old." Margaret nodded slowly. "What happened?" "Fire 7 years ago. We lost everything, no. The ranch, the livestock, my parents and sister." Clara's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled around her coffee cup. "I barely escaped. Spent the last 7 years in Boston trying to forget I'd ever been anything but a city seamstress. And now you're back to ranching because you had no choice." Something like that. Clara met Margaret's eyes. "Are you going to tell Jack, tell everyone that I've been lying?" "That depends. Are you planning to keep lying, or are you ready to be honest about who you are and what you can do?" Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, turning the afternoon wild and dangerous. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "Being honest means facing things I've spent 7 years trying to avoid. Means risking people asking questions about what really happened in Ohio. And keeping up the pretense means limiting yourself to what Clara the seamstress could reasonably accomplish, even when Clara the rancher's daughter could do better. It was a fair point. Clara had been holding back instinctively, allowing her true capabilities to show only gradually. But managing a ranch successfully might require more skill than she could safely display while maintaining her deception. There's something else, Clara said, making another dangerous decision. I received a letter today from something called Blackwood Mining and Development. They want to buy my property. Margaret's expression hardened. Tom Blackwood. Should have known he'd surface eventually. You know him? Know of him. He's been acquiring property throughout the territory, usually from people facing financial difficulties. Claims to be developing mining operations, but I've never seen evidence of actual mining. What do you think he's really doing, Boom? Land speculation, most likely. Buying cheap, holding until values increase, then selling to railroads or other development interests. Margaret's voice was grim. He's particularly aggressive about targeting operations run by women or recent arrivals, people he thinks won't have resources to fight back. Clara felt cold. That had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Fight back against what? Pressure tactics, legal challenges, equipment failures, livestock losses. Nothing provable as sabotage, but too coincidental for comfort. You think he forces people to sell by making ranch operations impossible? I think Tom Blackwood is very good at creating problems that make his purchase offers look reasonable by comparison. The storm was beginning to pass, thunder growing more distant and rain softening from violent drumming to steady patter. Clara felt as if the weather had externalized the emotional turbulence of the evening's revelations. What should I do? First, don't respond to his letter immediately. Appearing too eager or too resistant can both create difficulties. Second, document everything about your property and operation. If strange problems start developing, you'll want records to prove timing and patterns. Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. Third, start being honest about your capabilities. If Blackwood decides to target your operation, you'll need every advantage you can get. That includes skills you're pretending not to have and help from people who understand your real situation, including Caleb Morrison. Especially Caleb Morrison. His family has been in this valley longer than almost anyone else. He has influence and connections that could prove valuable. Margaret smiled slightly. Also, unless I'm very much mistaken, he's interested in more than just your legal affairs. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. What makes you say that? The way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. The way he found excuses to check on your progress more frequently than strictly necessary. The way he offered help that goes well beyond professional obligation. The storm had passed completely, now leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the kind of profound quiet that follows violent weather. Clara felt as if something fundamental had shifted during their conversation. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you trust someone with secrets that could destroy everything you're trying to build? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. You don't trust them with secrets. You trust them with truth. Secrets have power because they're hidden. Truth only has the power you give it. What if the truth is worse than the secret? Then you deal with the consequences of truth instead of living in fear of discovery. In my experience, most people are more understanding about honest mistakes than deliberate deception. They talked until the clouds dispersed completely, leaving behind moonlight that painted the valley silver and peaceful. Margaret declined Clara's offer to stay the night, mounting her horse as stars began emerging in the clearing sky. Think about what I said, Margaret called as she prepared to ride home, about truth and trust and the fact that you don't have to face whatever's coming alone. Clara stood on the porch watching Margaret disappear into the night, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. The conversation had changed everything and nothing. She still faced the same choices about disclosure and deception, but now she understood the stakes more clearly. That night, Clara sat at Theodore's kitchen table reading through his papers with new understanding. Among them, she found correspondence with Thomas Blackwood dating back 2 years. Offers to purchase the property, each more insistent than the last. Theodore had declined repeatedly, but the final letter suggested Blackwood wouldn't accept refusal indefinitely. Circumstances change rapidly in frontier territories. The letter concluded, I hope you'll reconsider my offer before such changes affect your operation's viability. Threat or prediction? Clara couldn't tell, but the timing troubled her. Theodore's sudden death, the inheritance that brought Clara West Blackwood's immediate renewed interest in the property. Too many coincidences for comfort. Clara prepared for bed with Margaret's words echoing in her mind. Truth only has the power you give it. Maybe it was time to stop giving her secrets so much power over her choices. Maybe it was time to trust that some people were worth the risk of honesty. Maybe Montana would teach her the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. She fell asleep planning conversations that might change everything, dreaming of possibilities that felt both terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. The decision came easier than Claire expected when she woke to find smoke rising from Margaret Sullivan's property. She spotted the fire from her bedroom window while dressing for another day of careful pretense. Dark smoke billowing against the morning sky in quantities that suggested more than controlled burning. Clara abandoned her careful morning routine and ran for the barn, where Dusty waited in his stall. The ride to Margaret's ranch took 25 minutes at full gallop, Clara pushing her horse harder than wisdom would normally dictate. But the alternative, arriving too late to help, was unacceptable. Margaret's ranch showed signs of recent fire, but the flames were already contained under control efforts by Margaret and two hired hands. The damage appeared significant but not devastating. A storage building reduced to charred timbers, sections of fence line, destroyed hay stores consumed. "Margaret," Clara called as she dismounted, abandoning any pretense of awkward horsemanship. "Are you hurt?" "Fine, though it was closer than I like." Margaret's face was streaked with soot, her clothes singed from fighting flames. "Started about 2 hours ago, spread faster than natural fire should. We managed to contain it before it reached the main buildings or livestock areas." Clara studied the burn pattern with eyes trained from childhood to assess fire damage. "Any idea what started it?" "Found evidence of accelerant near the storage building. Someone wanted this fire to burn hot and fast." Margaret's expression was grim. "This wasn't an accident, Clara. This was a message." "Message about what?" "About what happens to people who don't cooperate with certain business interests. I received a visit yesterday from someone claiming to represent Blackwood Mining. Made it clear that my continued resistance to selling would be ill-advised." Clara felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. The same tactics she remembered from Ohio. Fire as intimidation, property damage, as pressure to sell below market value. "It gets worse," Margaret continued, leading Clara toward the porch. "After the fire started, I found this nailed to my door." She handed Clara a piece of paper with crude lettering. "Stubborn women learn hard lessons. Next time we won't be so careful about avoiding the house." Clara read the note twice, her anger building with each word. "We need to contact territorial authorities. This is criminal intimidation, possibly attempted murder. Authorities are 3 days' ride from here, and they'll want proof beyond circumstantial evidence and an unsigned note. By the time they investigate, more damage could be done." Margaret studied Clara's face, seeing determination that hadn't been there during their earlier conversations. "You've made a decision about something." "Yes, I'm done pretending to be helpless when I have skills that could help fight this." Clara met Margaret's eyes directly. "And I'm done lying about why Thomas Blackwood might be targeting people in this valley." Clara spent the afternoon helping Margaret document fire damage while revealing the complete truth about her past. About William Turner and the destruction of her family's Ohio ranch. About Rose's death and 7 years of running from questions she'd been too frightened to answer. About the growing certainty that Thomas Blackwood and William Turner were the same man. "That would explain the escalation," Margaret said as they examined evidence of arson in the destroyed storage building. "If Blackwood thinks you have information he needs, he'll continue increasing pressure until you give him what he wants. Or until he eliminates the problem permanently." Clara finished the thought neither wanted to voice completely. "Which means running away won't solve anything. He's found you, once he'll find you again." Margaret's voice carried the determination of someone who'd faced challenges that could have broken her. "Time to stop being victims and start fighting back." "What does that mean?" "It means we make their operations more expensive than leaving us alone would be. We turn their tactics against them. We fight fire with fire." Clara felt fierce satisfaction at the prospect of active resistance rather than passive victimhood. 7 years of looking over her shoulder, 7 years of allowing fear to define her choices. Time to stop being afraid and start being angry instead. They spent the evening on Margaret's porch, planning defensive measures and offensive responses as sunset painted the mountains, impossible shades of hope and determination. The key is making their operations unprofitable, Margaret explained. They succeed through intimidation because most people don't fight back effectively. Change that calculation and they'll move on to easier targets. What about evidence of criminal activity if we can prove they're using arson and threats? Evidence is good for long-term justice, but long-term justice won't help if they kill us before we can present it. Short-term survival requires immediate deterrence. Clara understood the distinction. Legal justice and practical survival operated on different timelines required different strategies. Margaret, I need to ask something that might sound paranoid. Do you think my uncle's death was actually natural? Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying the darkening sky. I wondered about that timing myself. Theodore dies suddenly, just when property values in this area are rising due to railroad speculation. His niece inherits with conditions that ensure extended residence, making her available for whatever pressure Blackwood wants to apply. So you think his death might have been murder? I think coincidences that convenient deserve investigation. Though proving murder after the fact would be nearly impossible, especially if it was done with methods that mimic natural illness. Clara felt rage building at the possibility that Theodore had been killed to facilitate whatever scheme was unfolding around her inheritance. If they murdered Theodore to get access to me, if they're willing to burn property and threaten lives, then they're not going to stop until they get what they want, or until we make continuing more dangerous than abandoning their plans. Margaret met Clara's eyes. The question is whether you're ready to fight that kind of war. Clara thought about Rose dying in a burning barn, about 7 years of running from shadows, about Caleb's offer of partnership and Margaret's willingness to face danger for someone else's sake. Yes, she said quietly, I'm ready to fight. The next morning brought the confrontation Clara had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She was working with Jack on fence repairs when Caleb Morrison rode into the ranch yard earlier than usual, his expression grim. We need to talk, he said without preamble. All of us, about what happened at Margaret's place yesterday and what it means for everyone in this valley. Jack straightened from his work, recognizing something in Caleb's tone that suggested serious trouble. How bad is it? Bad enough that pretending these are isolated incidents isn't an option anymore. Caleb dismounted, his gaze shifting between Clara and Jack. Margaret told me about the fire, about the threats. She also told me some things about Clara's background that explain why Blackwood might be targeting this particular property. Clara felt her carefully constructed world shifting. Margaret had revealed her secrets without permission, had made decisions about disclosure that should have been Clara's to make. What did she tell you? Clara asked carefully. Enough to understand that you've been hiding capabilities that could be crucial for defending this ranch. Enough to know that Thomas Blackwood isn't just any land speculator. Caleb's expression was serious but not judgmental. Enough to realize that you've been carrying burdens that no one should have to bear alone. Clara looked between the two men, seeing acceptance rather than accusation in their faces. The moment of complete exposure she'd been dreading, but without the destruction she'd expected. Are you angry that I lied? I'm concerned about why you felt lying was necessary, Caleb said quietly. I'm sympathetic to whatever drove you to such measures, and I'm grateful to finally understand what we're really dealing with. Which is, Jack asked. Clara took a deep breath and began with the truth she should have told from the beginning. About growing up on a ranch in Ohio, about William Turner's pressure campaign, about the fire that killed Rose and destroyed everything her family had built. About 7 years of running from a man who might have followed her west. Jack listened without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as Clara described Turner's methods and the suspicious timing of her inheritance. So this Blackwood character might be the same man who destroyed your family's ranch, Jack said when Clara finished. And he's using the same tactics here that worked in Ohio. It would explain his persistence, Caleb agreed. Also explains why he's targeting Margaret and potentially other neighbors. If his goal is isolating Clara from potential support, eliminating allies makes strategic sense. So what do? Clara asked. We prepare for escalation while documenting everything for territorial authorities, Caleb said. We coordinate our defenses, establish communication protocols, make it clear that this valley won't surrender to intimidation. And we stop pretending Clara doesn't know how to handle ranch operations, Jack added with a slight smile. Might be time to let her demonstrate what she's really capable of. Clara felt something tight in her chest, finally relaxing. The fear of discovery that had shadowed her every interaction, every decision, every moment of the past weeks. There's something else, she said. Something Rose told me the night she died, something I've been trying not to remember. Both men waited patiently for her to continue. She said she'd found something in the barn that didn't belong. Something someone had left behind. She was going to show me after we finished with the horse, but the fire started before she had the chance. Evidence of Turner's plans, Caleb asked, or evidence of his methods, something that could prove he was responsible for the fire. Clara's hands clenched into fists. Rose died trying to save information that could have brought him to justice. I've spent 7 years running instead of remembering, instead of seeking the justice she died trying to provide. Memory can be unreliable after trauma, Caleb said gently. Don't blame yourself for protecting your mind from things too painful to process immediately. But trauma can also preserve details that conscious memory can't access, Clara replied. Maybe what I need is the right trigger to help me remember what Rose wanted me to know. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A single rider appeared on the access road, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Speak of the devil, Jack muttered as the rider resolved into a tall, well-dressed man on an expensive horse. Clara felt recognition hit her like a physical blow. Even at distance, even after 7 years, she knew that bearing that arrogant posture that suggested ownership of everything surveyed. William Turner had found her. The man who dismounted at Clara's porch was older than she remembered. His dark hair, now silver-streaked, his face more lined by years and weather. But the cold eyes were the same, the calculating smile that had made her father's hands clench into fists. Miss Whitmore? His voice was carefully modulated, designed to project reasonable authority. I'm Thomas Blackwood from Blackwood Mining and Development. I believe you received my letter regarding your property. I received it. Clara remained beside the fence, not approaching, flanked by Jack and Caleb, in a show of solidarity that felt more protective than she'd experienced in 7 years. I'm not interested in selling. I see, that's unfortunate. Perhaps you don't fully understand the challenges facing ranch operations in this territory. Turner's gaze shifted to encompass Jack and Caleb, assessing potential threats. Weather uncertainties, market fluctuations, equipment, failures, accidents that can destroy years of work in a matter of hours. The threat was clear despite civilized language. Clara felt anger override fear for the first time since Rose's death. I understand the challenges perfectly, Mr. Blackwood. Or should I call you Mr. Turner? Turner's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing recognition and calculation beneath the polite facade. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Miss Whitmore. Don't you? You understood it perfectly 7 years ago in Ohio when you murdered my family to acquire property below market value. That's a very serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support such claims? Clara studied his face, seeing confirmation of everything she'd suspected. Turner had orchestrated Theodore's death, had been patiently maneuvering her into position for whatever endgame he'd planned. I have 7 years of wondering what Rose found in our barn the night you burned it. 7 years of remembering fragments that might become clear under proper circumstances. Turner's expression hardened slightly. Memory can be unreliable, Miss Whitmore. Trauma often creates false recollections that seem real to the person experiencing them. Can it or can trauma preserve important details that conscious memory requires specific triggers to access? I suppose that would depend on what kind of triggers you're referring to. Clara smiled, seeing Turner recognize that his psychological intimidation wasn't producing intended effects. The kind that involves federal investigators examining property records, interviewing survivors, analyzing patterns of suspicious business practices across multiple territories. Turner was quiet for a moment, reassessing his approach. When he spoke again, his voice carried open menace. Miss Whitmore, I think you are operating under dangerous misunderstandings. This territory can be fatal for people who make enemies of powerful interests. Accidents happen frequently in remote areas. People disappear without explanation. Is that a threat, Mr. Turner? Information, The same kind I provided to your uncle before his sudden illness convinced him that leaving property to you was his wisest option. Clara felt cold rage at confirmation that Theodore had been murdered to facilitate Turner's scheme. What do you want? What I've always wanted. Information about what your sister discovered before her unfortunate death. Evidence that needs to be recovered or destroyed to protect certain business interests. And if I don't have that information, if Rose died before she could show me what she'd found, then we'll explore methods of enhancing your memory. Fire can be remarkably effective for triggering traumatic recall. Clara's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle Jack had insisted she carry. You're threatening to burn my property to force psychological breakthrough. I'm suggesting that similar circumstances might produce similar results. People often remember crucial details under stress that remain inaccessible during normal mental states. Caleb stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Mr. Turner, I think you've said enough. Time for you to leave. Mr. Morrison, Turner's voice carried forced civility. I wasn't aware Miss Whitmore had legal counsel present. She has more than legal counsel. She has neighbors who take threats against community members seriously. Turner studied the three of them, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted against his favor. Clara could see him evaluating whether violence was worth the risk of witnesses and resistance. I see Miss Whitmore has been sharing certain theories about past events, Turner said finally. Theories that could prove dangerous if they reached inappropriate ears. The only danger, Jack said quietly, is to people who use murder and terrorism to advance business interests. Turner smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. I think you're all underestimating the scope of what you're involving yourselves in. This situation extends well beyond territorial jurisdictions. Important people in distant places have interests that require protection. Are you threatening federal investigators? Clara asked. I'm noting that federal investigators experience unfortunate accidents just like anyone else who interferes with significant operations. The mask was completely off now. Turner was revealing the extent of whatever organization backed his pressure campaign, confident that understanding the scope would convince Clara and her allies to surrender. Instead, it convinced Clara that fighting was the only option that didn't end with everyone she cared about dying. Mr. Turner, Clara said quietly, I think our conversation is finished. Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll reconsider your position before circumstances force more dramatic demonstrations of consequences for refusing reasonable cooperation. Turner remounted with theatrical courtesy, but his eyes held promises of violence that made Clara's skin crawl. I'll give you 3 days to think about our discussion. After that, events will proceed regardless of your cooperation. He rode away at an unhurried pace, confident in his power to destroy everything Clara had built if she continued resisting his demands. Well, Jack said as Turner disappeared beyond the first hill, that was illuminating. He killed Theodore to get me here, Clara said quietly, murdered my uncle to facilitate whatever he thinks I know about Rose's discovery. And he's planning to recreate the Ohio fire to trigger your traumatic memories, Caleb added, just like he did 7 years ago. Clara looked at the two men who'd chosen to stand with her against threats that could destroy them all. I'm going to give you one final chance to walk away from this, she said. Turner's not working alone, and he's willing to kill anyone who opposes him. You don't owe me anything that justifies risking your lives. Actually, Caleb said, we do owe you something. We owe you the same support any neighbor deserves when facing criminal pressure. And we owe ourselves the satisfaction of ensuring Turner doesn't succeed again. Besides, Jack added, Turner's already threatened everyone who's helped you. Walking away won't guarantee safety, but fighting back might guarantee justice. Clara felt emotion tighten her throat. For 7 years, she'd carried the burden of Rose's death alone, convinced that involving others would only create more victims. Now she had allies willing to share both risk and responsibility. All right, she said quietly. We have 3 days to prepare for whatever Turner has planned. 3 days to turn his advantages against him. What do you have in mind? Caleb asked. Clara smiled, and for the first time in 7 years, it carried the fierce joy Rose would have recognized. I have in mind giving Mr. Turner exactly what he's asking for. We're going to stage the fire that triggers my traumatic memories and provides him with the information he wants. Except, Jack said, understanding beginning to dawn, The information will be exactly what we want him to have instead of what he expects to get. Precisely. Turner thinks he's conducting this operation. Time to show him who's really in control. That evening, Clara began planning the confrontation that would end 7 years of running and finally provide justice for Rose's memory. The war was about to begin in earnest, and this time Clara Whitmore was done being afraid. She was ready to be dangerous instead. The trap was set for tomorrow night, but Clara woke on the appointed morning with dreams of Rose filling her mind with startling clarity. Not the nightmares that had haunted her for 7 years, but memories she'd thought lost forever. Rose laughing as they raced horses across Ohio pastures. Rose's patient voice explaining the intricacies of cattle breeding. Rose's excitement the morning she discovered whatever evidence Turner had later killed her to conceal. Clara sat up in Theodore's bed as dawn painted the mountains gold and pink, finally remembering what she'd spent 7 years trying to forget. Rose hadn't found evidence in the barn the night of the fire. She'd found it 3 days earlier, hidden it somewhere. Turner wouldn't think to look spent those final days planning how to expose Turner's methods to authorities who would listen. The fire hadn't been about destroying property. It had been about silencing the one person who could prove William Turner was a murderer. Clara dressed quickly and went to find Jack, who was already in the barn preparing for what they all knew might be their last day of normal ranch operations. "I remember," she said without preamble. "What Rose found, where she hid it, why Turner killed her." Jack straightened from his work with the horses. "What kind of evidence?" "Documents proving Turner had murdered other ranchers to acquire their property. Names, dates, methods. Rose found Turner's records when she went to retrieve a horse he'd borrowed from our father." Clara's voice grew stronger as memories clicked into place. She made copies, hid the originals where Turner couldn't find them, planned to turn everything over to federal marshals the week after the fire. Where did she hide them? Somewhere Turner searched but didn't recognize. Somewhere he would have dismissed as unimportant. Clara felt pieces fitting together with satisfying certainty. She hid them in our mother's sewing basket tucked inside quilt patterns that looked like household decoration. Jack was quiet for a moment, processing implications. If Rose made copies, if she had proof of multiple murders, then Turner's been searching for evidence that could destroy his entire operation. Not just in Montana, but everywhere he's used the same methods. Clara felt fierce satisfaction at finally understanding the stakes. He's not just trying to acquire my property. He's trying to eliminate the last person who might know where proof of his crimes is hidden. Except the evidence is in Ohio in a burned-out farmhouse Turner probably searched thoroughly after the fire. No, Clara smiled, remembering Rose's cleverness. Rose was too smart to leave evidence where Turner could find it. She gave the copies to someone she trusted, someone who would keep them safe until the right moment. Who? The minister's wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Harper. Rose told her she was collecting quilt patterns for our mother's birthday, asked if she could store them at the church until the celebration. Clara felt memory returning with startling clarity. Mrs. Harper thought she was helping plan a surprise. She had no idea she was preserving evidence of multiple murders. Jack leaned against the barn wall, absorbing this information. "So the evidence Turner wants doesn't exist in your memory. It exists in an Ohio church in the possession of someone who doesn't know what she's protecting." "Exactly. Which means Turner's entire Montana operation is based on a false assumption. He's been orchestrating increasingly dangerous schemes to force me to remember information I never possessed." "Have you told Caleb about this?" "Not yet, but I will as soon as he arrives for our final planning session." They spent the morning making final preparations for the evening's confrontation. Clara and Margaret had designed an elaborate deception involving a staged fire in an abandoned building on Clara's property, carefully planned to give Turner the impression that traumatic stress was forcing recovered memories. The goal was to feed Turner false information that would lead him into a trap while providing territorial authorities with evidence of his criminal methods. Caleb arrived at midday with news that changed everything. "Federal marshals are already en route to investigate suspicious land acquisitions in this territory," he announced as he dismounted. "Someone in Washington received reports about patterns of mysterious deaths and forced property sales across multiple Western territories." "How do you know this?" Clara asked. "Territorial Governor's Office received advance notice yesterday. Marshals will be here within the week to examine records and interview witnesses." Caleb's expression was grim. which means Turner's running out of time to eliminate evidence and potential witnesses. All the more reason to proceed with tonight's plan, Margaret said, having arrived earlier to coordinate final details. If we can get Turner to reveal his methods while federal marshals are en route, there's something else, Clara interrupted. I've remembered what Rose actually discovered, and it changes everything about our situation. She explained about the documents Rose had found, the copies hidden in quilt patterns, the evidence that could implicate Turner in murders across multiple territories. So, Turner's not just trying to acquire your property, Caleb said when she finished. He's trying to eliminate someone who might lead investigators to evidence that could destroy his entire operation. Evidence that's been sitting in a church in Ohio for 7 years, protected by a woman who thinks she's guarding quilt patterns. Margaret whistled softly. If that evidence still exists, if Mrs. Harper kept it safe, then we don't need to recover my memories, Clara said. We need to survive long enough for federal marshals to retrieve the real evidence and use it to prosecute Turner for everything he's done. Which means tonight's plan just became even more important, Caleb said. We need to keep Turner focused on forcing information from you instead of searching for alternative sources. They spent the afternoon refining their strategy, coordinating with neighbors who'd agreed to serve as witnesses, positioning themselves for what everyone understood might be a fight to the death. As sunset approached, Clara found herself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the satisfaction of finally understanding what Rose had died trying to accomplish. Her sister hadn't just discovered evidence. She'd ensured that evidence would survive even if she didn't, had trusted the right person to preserve proof that would eventually bring justice for all of Turner's victims. Rose had been braver and cleverer than Clara had ever given her credit for. Tonight would determine whether Clara was worthy of her sister's sacrifice. Turner arrived after full darkness, approaching the abandoned building where Clara waited with the confidence of a predator certain of victory. He wasn't alone. 3 men accompanied him, all armed, all moving with the practiced coordination of people accustomed to violence. Miss Whitmore, Turner's voice carried across the clearing between buildings. I'm pleased you've decided to be reasonable about recovering important information. Clara stood in the doorway of the building they'd prepared for the confrontation, kerosene-soaked wood, and carefully placed accelerants ready to create the traumatic recreation Turner expected. I'm tired of running, she called back. Tired of nightmares and fear and looking over my shoulder. If recreating that night in Ohio will let me remember what Rose found, then let's get this over with. Turner approached with his men, all of them studying the building and surroundings for signs of trap or ambush. Clara had been counting on their caution, their assumption that fear had driven her to surrender rather than preparation for resistance. Where are your neighbors? Turner asked, noting the apparent absence of Caleb and Jack. I expected more witnesses to this reunion. I sent them away. Whatever I remember tonight, I don't want innocent people hurt because of my family's problems. Turner smiled, satisfied that isolation was complete and resistance eliminated. Very wise. Some conversations require privacy to reach satisfactory conclusions. Clara led Turner and his men into the building, playing her role of traumatized victim, seeking closure through controlled recreation of past trauma. The interior was arranged to suggest a barn complete with hay bales and horse equipment that would trigger memories of Ohio. Light the hay, Turner instructed one of his men. Miss Whitmore needs proper atmosphere for memory recovery. Flames spread quickly through prepared accelerants, filling the building with smoke and heat that made Clara's pulse race with remembered terror. For a moment, the careful control she'd maintained for weeks threatened to shatter under the weight of genuine traumatic response. Then she heard Rose's voice in memory, not screaming in terror, but laughing with fierce joy. Clara, you're braver than you know. Trust yourself like I trusted Mrs. Harper. Clara steadied her breathing and began the performance that would either save everyone she cared about or get them all killed. I can see it, she gasped, letting smoke and fear make her voice shake convincingly. The night Rose died, she'd been excited about something she'd found, something she said would change everything. What kind of something? Turner moved closer, his attention focused entirely on Clara's words. Papers, documents she'd taken from your office when she went to return the horse. Clara swayed slightly as if overwhelmed by returning memory. She said you'd been careless, left evidence where someone might find it. What kind of evidence? Names, other ranchers you'd killed to acquire property? Methods you'd use to make deaths look accidental. Clara let her voice break with apparent emotion. She'd made copies, hidden them somewhere safe, planned to turn everything over to federal marshals. Turner's face transformed from satisfaction to deadly focus. Where did she hide the copies? I don't know. She died before she could tell me. Clara met his eyes with apparent desperation. That's what you want to know, isn't it? Where Rose hid proof of your crimes. Among other things, Turner gestured to his men who moved to block the building's exits. But there are other questions that require answers. What other questions? Whether anyone else knows about your recovered memories, whether your helpful neighbors understand what they've been protecting, whether eliminating you will be sufficient to protect ongoing operations. Clara felt cold realization that Turner had never intended to let her survive this encounter, regardless of what information she provided. I haven't told them anything, she said, allowing genuine fear to color her voice. They think I'm a seamstress learning to ranch, nothing more. I'm afraid recent events suggest otherwise. Turner smiled without warmth. Margaret Sullivan's investigation into my business practices, Caleb Morrison's coordination with territorial authorities, Jack Sullivan's questions about Theodore's death. Too much curiosity for coincidence. The building was filling with smoke as flames consumed prepared materials, but Turner seemed content to continue their conversation despite the growing danger. Which means, he continued, that eliminating potential witnesses has become necessary for protecting important interests. Clara realized with horrifying clarity that Turner intended to kill not just her, but everyone who'd helped her, everyone who might carry dangerous knowledge to federal investigators. They're innocent, she said desperately. They don't know anything that could hurt you. Perhaps, but innocent witnesses can become dangerous ones if they ask the right questions. Turner moved closer, his eyes reflecting firelight and deadly intent. Better to eliminate possibilities before they become problems. Clara was preparing to signal for Caleb and Jack to spring their ambush when gunfire erupted outside the building. Not the controlled response they'd planned, but the chaotic violence of an operation gone wrong. "Federal marshals!" a voice shouted from the darkness beyond the flames. "Throw down your weapons." Turner's expression shifted from confidence to fury to calculation in the space of seconds. Clara realized that their careful timing had been disrupted by the early arrival of federal investigators. "Killer!" Turner snarled to his men, drawing his own weapon. Burn everything. Eliminate all evidence." Clara dove for cover behind hay bales as bullets shattered wood around her, the building filling with smoke and flame and the sounds of battle. Through the chaos, she could hear Caleb's voice calling her name, Jack, shouting coordinates, federal marshals demanding surrender. But Turner and his men were fighting with the desperation of people who understood that capture meant execution for multiple murders. Clara crawled toward the building's rear wall, searching for an exit that hadn't been blocked by Turner's men. Smoke was making breathing difficult. Flames were consuming the structure faster than planned, and the sounds of gunfire suggested the battle outside was far from won. She found a window partially obscured by smoke and debris, managed to break through the glass and tumble into the night air beyond. Rolling away from the building, Clara found herself in the middle of a firefight between Turner's men and a combination of federal marshals and her neighbors. Clara, Caleb appeared beside her, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward cover behind a stone outcropping. "Are you hurt?" "No, but Turner's planning to kill everyone who helped me. He thinks we all know too much about his operations." "Federal marshals arrived 6 hours early," Caleb explained between bursts of gunfire. "Someone in Washington decided the situation was urgent enough to warrant immediate intervention." "Where are Turner's men?" "2 down, 1 captured. Turner himself is still in the building, refuses to surrender." Clara looked at the structure that was now completely consumed by flames, smoke billowing into the night sky like a beacon visible for miles. "He'd rather burn than face trial for murder," she said. "Can't say I blame him. Federal marshals found evidence in his hotel room, linking him to at least dozens suspicious deaths across 3 territories." Caleb's expression was grim. He was facing execution, regardless of what happened tonight. The gunfire was tapering off as Turner's remaining resistance crumbled. Clara watched the building burn, thinking about justice delayed, but finally it achieved, about Rose's sacrifice, finally bearing fruit after 7 years. "Caleb," she said quietly, "there's something else. Something about evidence Rose hid that could prove Turner's guilt in crimes beyond what federal marshals have discovered. She explained about the documents hidden in quilt patterns about Mrs. Harper in the church in Ohio, about proof that could implicate Turner in murders spanning years and multiple territories. "We need to wire Mrs. Harper immediately," Caleb said when she finished. "If that evidence still exists." Their conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crash as the building's roof collapsed, sending sparks and flames high into the night sky. Turner's voice, if it had still been audible above the roar of fire, was silenced forever. "There," Clara said simply, "it's finished." But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew the real work was just beginning. 3 months later, Clara stood on her porch watching sunrise paint the Gallatin Valley gold and pink in impossible shades of promise. The mountains stood eternal and protective, the grasslands stretched green and peaceful, and the cattle grazed contentedly on land that finally felt completely safely hers. William Turner was dead, consumed by flames he'd started intending to torture information from Clara's memory. His associates had been arrested by federal investigators who'd found evidence of a conspiracy spanning decades and multiple territories. Most importantly, Mrs. Harper had preserved Rose's evidence with the devotion of someone who understood the importance of promises kept. The documents hidden in quilt patterns had provided federal authorities with proof of Turner's crimes that resulted in the prosecution of his surviving organization and compensation for families of his victims. Justice delayed but never abandoned had finally been served. Caleb emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his hair still rumpled from sleep. Clara accepted her cup gratefully, leaning into his warmth as they watched their world wake up together. They'd been married 2 weeks after Turner's death in a ceremony attended by Margaret and Jack and half the valley. Simple vows spoken on the boundary between their properties, promises of partnership, rather than possession commitment to building something together that honored both their independence and their love. "Any regrets?" Caleb asked quietly. Clara considered the question seriously. Did she regret the violence, the necessity of fighting fire with fire, the fact that justice had required becoming harder than she'd ever wanted to be? "None," she said finally. "Rose would be proud that we fought back instead of running away." "And what about us? Any regrets about choosing partnership over solitude?" Clara smiled, thinking about love that was collaboration rather than dependent support that strengthened, rather than diminished trust that had grown from shared danger and mutual respect. "None whatsoever. Rose would love knowing I found someone willing to stand with me instead of trying to protect me by keeping me small." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the valley emerge from shadow into light. This land had tested Clara beyond anything she'd imagined possible, had forced her to become stronger and braver and more honest than she'd ever thought she could be. It had given her back herself, had given her Rose's memory without the burden of survivor's guilt, had given her love that was partnership rather than rescue. Most importantly, it had taught her the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear, between protecting herself and limiting herself, between running from the past and learning from it. "Clara, bitch," Caleb said quietly, "I've been thinking about expanding operations, adding sheep to complement the cattle, maybe trying our hand at horse breeding." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful valley like a promise of joy yet to come. "I say we build something Rose would be proud of, something that lasts because it's grounded in truth instead of fear, love instead of obligation, courage instead of mere survival." I love that plan. Clara Whitmore had inherited a ranch she'd never expected and built a life she couldn't imagine losing, had faced her worst nightmares and discovered they couldn't destroy the woman she'd chosen to become, had learned that sometimes the only way to claim your future was to stop running from your past and fight for what mattered most. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana territory, Clara and Caleb planned improvements to land that would someday pass to children who would never know what it meant to live in fear of their own shadows. It was, Clara thought, exactly the legacy Rose would have chosen, the kind of future worth fighting for, worth risking everything to achieve, worth believing in, even when the odds seemed impossible. Montana had taught Clara Whitmore how to stop running and start building. Now it was time to see what kind of life 2 people could create when they chose courage over fear, truth over deception, love over safety. It was, she decided, going to be quite an adventure.